So, like I mentioned, Jack is the creator of these amazing drawing machines, and you'll see artwork made on the machines in the cafe bar at the moment. There's also 4 extra images outside in case you hadn't seen those. So we've got 20 in total. And this exhibition is part of a series of exhibitions we're doing at the Phoenix. Roughly every 3 months, we put a new collection of work up in the cafe bar, and it features, at the moment, we're looking at retrospectives, but it changes. Recently, we had work focused on the history of computer art in Leicester, which is surprisingly rich. We've had work by contemporary artists. The next one, for example, is work by Alex May. The current one by Jack, I've been keen on doing for quite a while because I'm a big fan of Jack's work. And what we try to do with all of the talks is combine them with an opportunity to meet the artist, either in person or in this case, via Zoom. So I think this session will last maybe an hour or so. We will take Jack and Rita's time for that first hour, and then afterwards there'll be time to have an explore with the machines and maybe a little play with them and understand a bit more about how they work. So let's start really, Jack, and we're going to format it as a bit of a conversation. We're obviously Jack saying a lot more than me. So Jack, I think we talked about maybe trying to understand a little bit about your interest and motivations behind getting involved with drawing machines, which I understand started in 1960.
Yeah, before we come to that, Sean, what I would like to do is very important, not about me, it's about the thanks. And I want to thank the Computer Art Society, because John Sharp, bless his locks, he's now deceased. He first published my work in Infinity magazine, which was a wonderful magazine. And then he introduced me to the Computer Art Society, which was wonderful. He invited me to present a paper to Bridges in 2006. And I met Alan Sutcliffe, again, sadly passed away from us. And he went on to cause my machines to be collected by the Science Museum. That was no small achievement. They listened to him and he just told them what they should do. And they said, yes, Alan, we'll do it, which was a tribute to Alan's influence because he worked longer. He was old enough to have worked with Alan Turing. Well, that was pretty good. Then Paul Brown encouraged me to pursue a PhD, which I was awarded by Manchester Metropolitan in 2011. And finally, thanks to Sean himself, he's tirelessly put work on this exhibition. But without help from all these kind people, none of this would be here. So it's very important to kick off this proceedings with thanks to all those involved. So I can now deal with your questions, but the important thing has happened already.
Great. Thanks, Jack. Yeah, I think it's a great example that it is important for people to identify and promote artwork. So even all the people here, if they see work by artists they like, everyone has a role in helping to promote and share this. So you've had some very good people involved in helping you share your artwork. So, and I'm happy to be one of them.
So you want me to talk about how I began, is that right?
Let's think a little bit about where you sort of started, because it's 1960. I don't think anybody here was born in 1960.
Well, even before that, I was in bomber command in the RAF as a regular airman. And looking back, it was a fantastic time. And I was very proud to be part of the Air Force. But they had a machine there. We used to have a Lancaster bomber in which I was privileged to be able to go and flying in. And they did ground surveys with, on an oscilloscope from radar research. I wound up as a maverick in radar research. And they had this wonderful machine that could convert black and white images from an oscilloscope into color. And that stuck in my mind. And I thought, this machine, the size of a room, was an inspiration. And it stuck in my mind for years and years. And it encouraged me to do stuff with the light machines, which was where it came from. So some of these things can hang around for an awful long time. So that started me off.
Jack, when was this? Would it have been in the 1950s?
In the 1950s, yes. I was in the Air Force from 1952 to 55, just after the war, when all the pictures we were processing were probably over Russia. But we weren't allowed to know. All we did was process the pictures and submit them to the top brass. But it was an interesting time. Then I went to art college after being a regular airman, and most of the people in Guildford, some of the older people there, they were all ex-RAF, and many of them ex-RAF photography. So when we started at Guildford, the people who come from the RAF were probably more technically informed than the staff, which we had to keep quiet about. But they did a demonstration, and they were swinging a treacle tin from a string high to the ceiling, and the dribble from it went onto a big piece of studio background, which they filled on 16mm, and it formed the picture of a harmonograph. And that got my mind working. So in 1960, I decided to build a machine that could mimic a harmonograph, but not use pendulums, because I thought pendulums were something you couldn't reset them. And that started me on the idea of programming. It would be nice to have a machine that instead of just swinging pendulums and hoping something would happen, you could interfere with it and get some programming done. So that's what I did. It was a very small machine, but it was the start of things in 1960. So that's how I began.
And Jack, was this made out of Meccano?
Yes, it was. I was, as a kid, I used Meccano all my life. It was a fantastic learning thing. And I often thought how nice it would be to build a machine that did drawings, but I never did anything about it because I was too young. But that got me started. And so the Meccano machine was mimicked a harmonograph. But the interesting thing was that the 4 cranks that were on a turntable, which produced the drawings, they were based on a simple thing, and it's so simple, it was easily missed. If you put 4 identical pulleys, the slippage on them will be just enough to make an organic growth of the line. And that idea has stuck with me ever since. So that if you have the machines having, I've had to get technical, it's the ratio between the X and Y axes in Cartesian coordinates, and they need to be got to as close a ratio as possible. And one of the machines that went to the Science Museum could get as close as 1 to 1.002, which is very, very close. It means a machine of great accuracy. What you've got there is a machine, the sine wave machine, which is similar in its ability to put line-to-line pictures down with great accuracy, as you've seen from some of Mazza's excellent pictures that he's done.
So what you're talking about there is that if 2 cogs were exactly the same, they would always produce the same image. But if
they would produce a Lissajous figure, if that's not getting technical, it's a mathematical figure. But if the 2 cogs were different by 999 and 1,000, then they would slowly change the shape that they drew. And that's what got me going in the first place. We'll come back to that in a moment. But I'm talking about deterministic versus randomness. And the machines we're talking about now are totally deterministic in that they rely on the physics and the relationship of XY coordinates. Again, if that's not too technical.
But of course, we'll come on to this, but the fact that they are deterministic in the sense that they do a well-defined process, there's no random number generator in them, doesn't stop the images always being different, because you can't control everything. There are always little changes which ensure that the images that you make are always different.
Well, Alan Turing set the word in motion way back in the 50s, and he made the statement, which is still echoing now, that it's very difficult to set the starting point of any generative machine. And so if you can't set the starting point, everything will be always different. And even if it differs by a fractional amount, it's the butterfly wing in South America affecting the weather in Russia. So it's that type of thing. And it's something that we've built on. We all stand on the shoulders of giants, as has been said.
Great. So you became interested in creating these, effectively a Meccano alternative to a harmonograph. And then where did you move on to after that?
Well, I decided that Meccano wasn't accurate enough, and I got involved in engineering because I wanted to build my own super wide angle cameras And I learned engineering and went to evening classes to learn how to use lathes and milling machines and that sort of thing. And the initial idea was to build high-definition cameras. But it seemed that those skills could be applied to building drawing machines and to increase the accuracy. So in the 70s, I was able to build machines which drew with light and graphics. And it's worthwhile giving a mention to Desmond Paul Henry, who was around in Manchester at the time, and I'm sorry I never knew him because we were doing very similar things. And his work is now in the V&A and the Science Museum. And the Science Museum have just acquired my Homage to Henry machine, where I reverse engineered his machines for his daughter. So that's a nice tie-up.
Yeah, and for people who don't know, Desmond Henry was another drawing machine pioneer, working from the late 50s and 60s through to 70s. And he had an interesting approach. He didn't make his own machine as such. He adapted a machine known as an air flight computer from a Lancaster bomber. Is that right?
Well, it was a spheric drawing machine, and he'd been in artillery, and the same type of machine for using artillery aircraft to shoot down enemy aircraft. It was the same type of analog computer that the aircraft used in the Lancasters, the Shackleton, all the bombers. And they worked on bomb aiming. And they were basically computing windage and airspeed. And he adapted those simple variations to make a turntable. And it's the two axes that I took in the re-engineering of his machine, which produced a very accurate result.
So this machine, I think your story and DP Henry's story are both interesting, because it started in machines made in the Second World War, but both of you took skills and literally a machine and turned them into art-making machines, because these computers, as they were analog devices, clockwork devices, effectively. And I think both of you realize that you can use these to control pens, and when you control pens, you start to make interesting images. So that there is often people say that innovation happens during war, and this is a different sort of innovation, but it enabled you to make mechanized drawing machines using similar technology.
The philosophy I think we could start to approach now is curiosity about delegating control to a machine, to a third party. And it takes a special type of idiot or artist or whatever you want to call them to say, I'm going to take my hands off, I'm going to see what happens, and I'm curious as to the result. And one of the rather bizarre things that I said was, whenever I saw a drawing produced by a machine that I'd let go, I used to say, I wouldn't have thought of doing that, which is very curious and illogical, but it does sum up the type of reaction. Because if you delegate the machine control to a third party, you're not sure what's going to happen, but you have to have the grace to accept it and say, is this an artwork or isn't it?
And so with your machines, so if we're looking at maybe the 1970s, you've developed a whole series of different sorts of machines to explore different ideas. You want to maybe give us a little summary of some of the machines that you've made?
Well, we've talked about the Lissajous figure generators, which were deterministic in the mathematical sense. And I also went on, the obvious thing was to build various forms of XY plotters with Cartesian coordinates. And that was the basis of some. But I also got interested in sine waves, and you've got a machine in front of you, which is a sine wave machine. And that is very similar to the one in the Science Museum, because when I gave all machines to the Science Museum, thought I was moving house, then I wasn't. And I thought, well, that's a nuisance. I better start and build them all again, which is what I did. It's how you come to have a similar machine. And that's an interest in the whole idea of sine waves and trying to put a sophisticated part of the machine which mimics the wave breakers well. So you're taking the basic deterministic sine wave, and then the process is very similar in a lot of my machines, is you start to interfere with the deterministic output, and then you start to mess it about and see how far you can push randomness, as it's termed, into the deterministic. And that summarizes the ethos of most of my motivation, in that it's the move from determinism to increasingly amounts of randomness.
Mm. And so, again, determinism is almost you tell it what to do and it does it. And then you have randomness where, like you were saying, it introduces this unpredictability and sometimes it surprises you.
Yes. Well, we agree, I think, as we've talked about this before, we agree on the randomness will take to mean unpredictable results. But this became more and more interesting, particularly when I started to deviate from machines which had integral programmers, and you just adjusted the setting of the machine and then let it run, and then you adjusted it again slightly differently and produce another result. But as soon as you introduced a programmer, which in the one that you've got, it's a rotary switch of 24 points, and they're divided into 4, 2, and 1 sections. And it's a homage to an Enigma machine that Turing built in the 50s. And it's capable of many thousands of alternatives, but it does send an impulse to an X motor, a Y motor, and a pen. And those 3 variables, you can produce just about anything.
I think we'll move on to the programmer very soon, but let's think a bit about some of those machines that you were building from the 70s. We've got 3 machines here on show. We have a machine that you call the drum machine, because it has a rotating drum, where some of us might think of percussive machines, but the drum machine. We have the XY, no, we don't have the XY machine. We have the sine wave machine, and we have a turntable machine. The XY machine, we're still working on making sure we understand it and get it working. Why did you develop different sorts of machines rather than focus on one machine and develop that? What was your motivation there?
Well, I realized that if you built a different machine, you could get a different variety of drawing. And I was interested in the basic idea being applied to different concepts. So the sine wave was one concept, the XY was another. But some of the machines you've got are quite late on in the development. And the turntable and the drum machine that you've got were designed specifically to help me write papers on introducing enough randomness into a picture to drive it to what I called near chaos. And I've written papers on that. I'm very interested in the edge of coherence, where a drawing goes to the point where you say, that's just a rough scribble, we can't make any sense of it. And I'm interested in the point just before you get to that point where you stop saying it's coherent. But that's getting to be very esoteric.
I think looking at a few of Maz's drawings here. So Paul Mazzatelli, who's in the audience, has taken it on to really understand these machines from an artist's perspective and has been doing some great work with them. If you look at a few drawings from different machines, maybe with the sine wave machines, this is quite an interesting one. It illustrates some of your points. I'll hold it up for the audience. In that there's regularity in there. It's clearly a sort of regular image, but there's also variety. Every time it repeats, it's slightly different. So if you were to follow the lines from bottom to top, as this runs through the machine, it's drawing the same sorts of things, sine waves, but because it's drawing them on different sort of amplitudes and whatever, you end up with a much more complex image than you might imagine for something that is just drawing a sine wave.
I think Maz has done a fantastic job because he's exploited the possibility of the sine machine. There are so many adjustments that you can make that virtually no 2 drawings will ever be the same. And Maz has got his head around it very, very quickly. And it's an interesting point we can debate later on. Because once the machine is there, it's like Hockney's machine. Long after Hockney is gone, they'll be using them to produce more Hockneys. And so we could debate that later on.
Okay, and I think also I did show you this earlier. This is one from the drum machine, whereas again, you can see it's made up of repeating parts, vertical, as it runs through the machine. These parts are repeated. But if you look at it closely, it's not the same pattern every time. There's always variety in there, which makes what you might think of as a simple image much more complex. Really nice image there.
Well, he's done well with that. But the other thing we should say is that there are various parameters, in addition to making different machines. I don't know why, but I looked at all the machines that are built around the world, people building drawing machines, and none of them seem interested in the things that I am. No one wanted, for instance, to lift the pen up and down and produce secondary patterns. And no one was interested in putting a forward reverse DC device. So you put something in the circuit that reverses the polarity and makes a sort of what I call a hand gestural type of thing, so that drawing thing, you do that type of thing with the drawing. And I wanted to mimic that just to add to the variety. And I think Maz has done a fantastic job. He's latched onto that very incredibly quickly. And of course, it means that the variety will never be the same in two drawings.
So it's worth noting here for the audience that you'll see the gaps between the lines. This is the pen lift going up and down, leaving marks behind. So as it runs through its cycle, moving up and down, it also lifts the pen, and you end up with these extra patterns. So you can see at the bottom here, we have these gaps, which aren't, it's drawing it line by line, but it results in almost like moire patterns and other things.
What it's doing, Sean, is interesting to point out about what you said there. The audience may not know, but the time machine is able to increase the amplitude of the wave and then decrease it. So there's a part of the machine which will govern the amount of wave size. So you've got wave size, you've got line to line differences, then you've got the pen lift. And if you add those parameters together, you get something capable of an enormous variety with very simple alterations.
And then let's comment, oh, there's something on the back as well. On this one, which was made on turntable machine, I think this maybe has within it that mixture of order and chaos, because the image itself, you know, to an extent, is that sort of loop polo mint shape. And if you look at it in detail, it's made up of regular stuff, but there's this additional part where it seems to go a lot more chaotic.
Well, that's got a pen lift as well if it's required. But it has a different way of using. If you look at it, the linkages form a different type of pattern. They contribute. The linkage has a swing arm as opposed to the X and Y coordinates of Cartesian ones. A close look at that, you'll see that the X and the Y is produced by a different type of linkage. And that's, again, something that each machine tries to explore and add a new bit of variety to it.
Great. Now, you talked about programmer, which for most people is a certain thing. It's writing a computer program. But one thing we should point out is that all your machines are analog devices. They're not digital computers, and therefore they're not programmed in the conventional way. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. We've tried to draw a differential between the two in our discussions in the past.
So when people come to have a look at the machine, they should bear in mind that there is not a computer in there, not even a little microcontroller hidden deep inside. These are all created by the movement of mechanical parts. Now, there's as we've identified, there's lots of variety that you can get out of the machines just by setting them up and watching them run. But you've also developed this analog programmer device, which we're still trying to get our heads around. I've been having a little play with it. Couldn't quite work out what was going on. Just that conversation earlier has answered a few questions, but I'm sort of gesturing to illustrate it. It's driven by a rotary switch. So as this moves around, it's able to make connections with some of the plugs on this device, and people can see it. The device is sitting over there, and as it goes around making connections, it triggers different frequency changes in the machines. Is that a way of describing? Good way of describing the programmer?
Well, all it's doing, the simplistic idea is that you have three units of operation, three actions. One is an X-axis. One motor drives the pen in a particular direction. The other is the Y, and the other is a pen. Now, right early on, I decided not just to lift the pen up and down, but also to build in a possibility for it to draw a circle. Now, depending on the time pulse that the programmer sends out, and all it is, it's not changing the voltage, it's just taking the time from, say, 1.5 seconds to 0.75 of a second to 0.375 of a second, or thereabouts. Those are just for instances. And by doing that and spreading that between the X, the Y, and the pen, you can get an inestimable variety of different drawings. And that's the exciting thing about generative analog art. You don't need a computer program. Coming back to just make an aside about computer programming, unless I'm wrong, and you can tell me off for oversimplifying it. I'm very happy to be told off on that. But I think with a computer program, and I've written some for a machine years ago, which was a Hewlett-Packard calculator plotter. Once you've written a program, even though you build in variations, it is likely to produce, it's out of your hands and it produces a similar type of thing each time, unless you build in it throwing a dice somewhere and making a random. But with the analog things, it is essentially very different. And I've tried to write about this and discuss it with people and get into a philosophical discussion about the two ways of working, neither of which is better than the other. They're just different. And it's important that Sean's point is well made.
Well, so this raises something that we've talked about and I'm very interested in. And I write computer programs and my artwork has random numbers in it, or had random numbers in it. And you write a command and you say, give me a random number and do something with that random number. And I never felt particularly comfortable with delegating that complex behavior to a computer, random. Write a command, rand 10, and it gives you a random number. What I like about your machines is that and you have got a random generator as well, but the variety comes from the inherent bits of randomness in the machines. So the cogs are never perfectly even. The linkages that connect the cogs together have a little bit of play in them and so on. So you're able to introduce variety, and I would say complexity, not just randomness, by virtue of the machine. It's part of the machine. And again, do you have any thoughts on that? That's my interest in how your machines can be random. But of course, you also have a random machine as well, which you might want to mention.
Yeah, well, taking on from what you've just said, it's very simple to describe the three things. DC motors get warm, they change their speed slightly under load, they're inherently unstable. And I've utilized that to perform some sort of input of randomness. Then there are the linkages. Normally, an engineer, to have any play in the system is abhorrent. But if you think of it the other way, as an artist, not as an engineer, you can say, I can use that play. It'll wobble a little bit differently each time. And then you can add a forward reverse on the DC input, which again is at a different rate. Say that is running at 20, and the other part of the machine is running at 22. Or even, preferably, you get two numbers which are likely, when multiplied, will not repeat for a long time. And that's a gearbox with asymmetric. And so you add all these factors together. And if you take a number and you take like 2 times 3 times 1.5 times 1.75 times 2.1, and you go on like that, you get a string of very large number variations, which any simple mathematician will tell you. So it's based on simple premises like that. And it's the road to complexity is to make small shifts in very simple things that string them together. And that's what we've been talking about in terms of analog machines. That's part of the program and how you achieve a certain amount of randomness.
That's it. So I love that the machines themselves have sufficient play within them that they will generate their own randomness. You don't have to write a command like in a computer program to simulate complexity. The machines themselves are complex things. I also thought about the randomness side of things, which is a big interest of yours. Do you want to say a little bit about your interest in randomness?
Well, it occurred to me some time ago, and it's been a progression of ideas ever since. The more randomness that I introduced, I was quite surprised how what I term the coherence, that is our ability to read meaning into an image, seems to stick with us. And it takes a lot of really pushing towards chaos before you destroy that coherence. And I'm very interested in that. And the third part of randomness, chaos, and subjectivity is the effect that the viewer has. And that's been written about in the past, and it's called the beholder's share. And of course, with an artwork, what I depend upon is whenever any of you address an artwork, you address it and you get out of it governed by what your life experience has brought to it, so that no two people will see an artwork in the same way. And it's a matter of capitalizing on that. And it is amazing for us philosophically to look at what Maz has done with the machines. And they're coming out now. And we can then debate, well, who owns the title to the drawing? Is it Maz, or is it me, or is it the machine? I took the machines to a primary school with 9 to 11-year-olds, and I managed to entertain them for 2 hours, which I thought was something of an achievement to keep their attention. And one little girl came up to me, and they all did drawings to take home with them from the machines. That was the idea, because the machines are so solid, they can't be spoiled. And she brought this picture up to me, and she said, "Mr. Tait, would you like to sign this picture?" And I said, "No, my dear, you did it on the machine. You should sign it." "No," she said, "it has to be yours because you designed the machine." Now that, from a 9-year-old, I thought was phenomenal understanding of art process. And it's a subject we can debate.
And if you replace drawing machine with AI, that is the issue that everyone's talking about at the moment. Where does the ownership come from?
Well,
yeah.
I think AI, the only drawback with AI, as I can see, it has to depend on what everybody has done. And if there's 90% nutcases putting things in and 10% sensible ones, you're going to get a 9-to-1 ratio where the nutcases are going to override everything. So I think that AI will prove to be unreliable in that it's already giving ridiculous answers to simple questions.
Well, that is a big question, a big discussion to have.
Yes, absolutely.
I would love to have a proper discussion about this idea of ownership, or who the originator. But before we do that, there was one thought was about your process. So I've come to understand your process quite well. And I've said this to you before, I break it down into 3 steps. And the role of the artist is present in each step. So first of all is the creation of the machines. I know you've disagreed in the past, but I see the machines as artworks.
No, I would agree. I take them as pieces of sculpture. That's fine.
Okay, great. So I think they're sculptural forms in their own right. There's what the machine produces, which is dependent on the machine, but also on the settings and the interests of the artist. So the artist using machine can produce their own images, select the ones they like, and so on. And then there's the third step, which is the work that you often do. I can see some images behind you where you take the machine drawing, you bring it into image tool like Photoshop, and then you colorize the image looking for patterns that you find interesting. Would you agree that that's your 3 key steps?
Well, there may be 4. What I coined an expression in my PhD of the fuzzy notion of intent. It came to reading about fuzzy logic, and I have an idea, and I called it a fuzzy notion of intent. And then I will go into the workshop, but this is the thing that I don't do. I don't do drawings very often of what I'm going to do. I let the materials, the machinery, the rods, the aluminium angle girders and so forth, all these suggest something, and it grows organically in the workshop. So that's the engineering part of Sean's analysis. And so the machines are built, but the important thing to remember about engineering is that I've found that invariably one goes to complexity, and then you resolve the complexity and you aim at more simplicity, because I think it's built in us that we tend to go complex, do things too complicated, and then say we ought to simplify this and it improves it. So a machine might go through 5, 6, 7, or 10 marks, which amounts, it explains why there are 60 different machines over the years. And then the next thing, which we come into what Sean and I have been doing recently, you have a number of pictures drawn, and you have to curate them. You rank order them in terms of quality. And people have asked me about the hit rate. And I thought the hit rate, when I was first asked, would be about 100 to 1. But the odd thing wasn't. It was 10 or 15 to 1. So you produce 10 or 15 drawings, and one would stand out. And don't ask me how one does this, I'm not sure. You said, that's the one to work on. Then it comes to Sean's point. Some of the drawings will suggest from after work in Photoshop. So I scan them, and Photoshop has this ability, as most of you know better than I do. You can click on a shape that's complete, and you can color it. And there are 16.7 million colors available in the computer. So you've got a big choice. And I do that intuitively. But people say, why do you add color to your drawings? And the answer I've come up with is sometimes it's not necessary. The drawings are okay on their own. But then other times, adding color enhances the message of the drawing and amplifies it. It's like having a radio signal. And I was very interested in radio as a kid. And you put in amplification, so you're amplifying the signal so it can be heard. So color amplifies the idea of the drawing, but makes it easier for the viewer, because the attention span of most artworks is 20 seconds. You've got to get that done in a short time. So the color often, it's like a bee is attracted to the color from scent to get the honey. So you attract people with the color, because most people are attracted by color more than shape or form. And then you can give them the message. Inadvertently, they're going to get the message of the drawing. Is that a logical answer?
That's good, yeah. And I think it's worth us noting that Harold Cohen, who is most definitely growing in stature, he was high in stature when he passed away, but now he's growing, had a similar sort of process in that he developed a computer program that was called Aaron, and Aaron would make black and white drawings, and he would then color them as a colorist. Now, he did try getting Aaron to do the coloring, but he actually felt that he was a better colorist than Aaron, the computer program. So he went back to the idea that he would be the colorist. So this multi-stage process that you've developed, there is another analogy out there. I think also talking about color, we should bear in mind that some of the images that you have are created using a light pen rather than a ink pen or a pencil. And that you create using your camera, a darkened area, the machine sits inside, and a colored LED is what you draw with on a very long exposure.
Yes, that's something I started in the 70s, because my background is photography, as you may have gathered. I was charged with the idea of starting schools of photography in Derby and then Manchester. And so being a photographer, drawing with light was exactly what I was inclined to do. So it was a matter of using an enlarger as a spot, putting something that ran around underneath the enlarger with a piece of color film on it in the dark, and then seeing what happened. So it's the same philosophical process that is going on there. And nowadays, with digital cameras, it is very easy to set up a digital camera in front of the machine. And the latest one I built, which will eventually come to Leicester, it has a black box around it, so that it can be used in daylight on the desk, instead of having to turn all the lights off and wait for things to happen. And so that's in work already. But drawing with light gives the possibility of something that occurred to me years ago. I had a disc projected onto a moving piece of paper, photographic paper, and the disc came out with shadows around them, and they were interpreted by the brain, the eye and brain combination, as being a photograph of something like a Smartie, because they look like the brain interprets them as three-dimensional. So some of the light drawings being photographic images, they never saw an object outside the camera, Well, this is the interesting philosophical thing. The brain and the eye want to interpret them as if they were a photograph of something in reality, in parentheses.
Mm. And I think in our exhibition here, we have a few of those images. Like you say, they look a bit like Smarties that have been arranged in patterns. So I think it's really interesting to know that there's no computer rendering involved. There's no actual object. It's just a light source captured in a slow image.
But if you move, I was obsessed by movement, and if you move a light source, you get some very interesting occurrences. If you move any light source, if you stood in a dark room with a torch and some colored gels, and you run around moving colored gels in the light source, you get some very interesting patterns and images. And this is what they're doing, but they've got a very clever bit of programming so that you're using X, Y, and pen movement. And the great programming choice is the choice of color you put in the light pen. And I have, at the moment, 3 different light pens, one of which can vary the shape of the dot. It's an old lens inside with an aperture which goes open and wide and close and wide. And as it goes around, it changes the color as well. So that gives you an enormous resource of variety to exploit.
That's amazing. Yeah. So now let's have a little chat about some of the issues or the interesting things that this way of working throws up. And in particular, about where the artistry lies, particularly when you're looking at other people using your machines. So myself and Maz, getting lots of name checks today, have been talking about this, and we've had the odd discussion about it, which is we're now custodians of these machines, and you're very keen that the machines aren't museum pieces, but they get used. And we're most definitely keen on doing that as well. These machines will be used and we will be maintaining them to ensure they're used for a long time. So it throws up a question. So who is the artist? So I'm going to refer to one of these again. So we look at an image like this, which is clearly an artistic image, without a doubt. Where does the artistry lie in that? Well, we're starting to realize it exists in a number of places. Now, you, as the maker of the machine, clearly enabled this machine to make this style of image, but you don't specify how the machine is going to be used. So it's a different time, different image every time. So there's clearly some Jack Tait in this image, but on the other hand, I think you'll recognize this doesn't really look a lot like your images. There's clearly a different artist involved in making these. So Maz, the artist, is also involved. And we've been wondering how to attribute these sorts of images. And one thought is that as the instrument maker, let's imagine if it's a musical instrument, you define what is possible. A saxophone will only make a certain sound, but the inventor of the saxophone, I don't know.
Adolf Sax.
Ah, was it really somebody?
Adolf Sax, his name was.
Adolf Sax. So they did have the name in. Well, okay. So in that case, we do acknowledge the inventor of the instrument every time we talk about it. But he doesn't, or they don't own every tune made on that instrument. We accept the skill of the instrument maker, the skill of the performer, but also the skill of the composer of the piece of music. So we recognize multiple contributions to that image. Do you think we're looking at something analogous here when we look at an image made by a skilled user of your machine, where the attribution of this image is to multiple artists?
Well, I'm quite relaxed, but I would like to find out what the audience might have an opinion on that. I don't mind. I'm quite happy for the machines to be used by other people, and we can let the debate run. But I don't mind the debate running on that because it's all part of the art process. And it's analogous, as you said, to an instrument maker or a camera maker. No one makes a camera has any control over how it's used. These are slightly different. These are machines designed to make art objects. But I have got no problem with the idea of other people using them and the attribution going to their input. What Maz has done, he's got an idea of what the machine can produce, and he's playing around with it in a creative way. And anything that results from it has got to have a large input of Maz into it and not from me. But I don't mind that. I don't have any proprietary feelings of ownership. I'm interested in the producing the sculptural machines for other people to enjoy.
Mm. So
But
again,
what's
I think this is,
anybody from the audience might like to contribute a comment on that?
yeah, that's true. So what do people think about attribution and ownership and the creative process? Do we have any thoughts? Let's imagine, okay, you were buying an artwork. Would you want to buy one that was definitely made by Jack, or would you be happy to buy one made by somebody using Jack's machines? Would you value them differently? Difficult question.
Analogy of an instrument is very good.
Mm.
I think you can transfer like stuff with music technology specifically, right? There's people who've been building software and hardware and the instruments for quite a long time that have, and the instrument has a sonic fingerprint, right? And you can say that's been made on a 808, for instance. And it's still great music, and it's still the artist's music. But that fingerprint of the technology person who imagined the technology is there. And I feel like that's a good analogy.
Yeah. So that the instrument analogy maybe is the one that we use. What I'm very interested in is I like the democratic nature of your work here, because you'll run off, and like you mentioned with the school children, you'll run off, let's call them tatergraphs,
Yeah.
and give to the young people or the audience. They can take away an original artwork. And we said this when we ran the workshop a couple of weeks ago. There's no other artwork like this. This is the only one, because you can't make a copy of it. So we were giving away original works to people. And I like that democratic side of it, that anyone potentially can come to a workshop, print off an image, and then take it away.
But I think it's important to think that other people produce that, but when I use the machine to make the artworks, that's part of a closed loop process. I designed the machine, had the idea of doing it, and then produce what I feel is the right thing, and that's an original tatergraph. And I'm quite I'm quite comfortable with that idea. But what I would expect that there may be a difference between what other people do, and there will be a difference in character, but not necessarily quality. But there's an instance where people did copies of Mondrian's work, and when subject to people's choices, nearly all of them chose the copies and not the original. So that says something. But one thing we haven't touched on is that the analog machines, by their nature, the wheels go round and you can see them and feel them and touch them going round. That means that the process in art, in generating an art object, is totally transparent. And that enthuses me a lot, because it tempts me to think, and I hope this isn't sounding any arrogance, that maybe we can get some insights into how art works. Because if everything is a black box in the computer, is not transparent, you can't see what goes inside the computer, but you can see what these machines do. You can watch the pen, you can watch the process of the artwork being produced by me or anybody else. It doesn't make any difference. But then you can start to think, well, can I learn anything about how art works? And that seems to be, and I think Harold Cohen was the man said that the task for the 21st century is to try and work out how art works. And I would go along with that. And he said it first, but I'll borrow that and use that idea as being a good incentive to work on these. So I don't know what anybody thinks about that.
I agree. I think with interesting art, good art, there are always multiple layers of interest. And what your machines do is you can really get in and look at the production of the artworks. You can understand how they're made because you can see the cogs and pens moving. Whereas I would agree, a computer programmer, well, the only person who understands a computer program is typically a computer programmer. So the general viewer, the art viewer, can't look at the computer program and necessarily make sense of it. Whereas I think most people can make sense of your machines because we're familiar with cogs and movement and so on. And I think what often fascinates people is that these repetitive patterns don't look repetitive. They look complex. It's not, they don't just see one process being repeated all the time. As the processes repeat, they generate interesting complexity. So you're right. I think this is an interesting one.
We're stuck. We've lost transmission.
Oh, okay. I lost you briefly then. Yes. So you're saying we were talking about the interesting mechanical process. I think it's great to be able to show people that. I would agree.
The analogy that I once said, people ask me, what's the difference between analog machines and computing? I said, well, the analogy with a computer is that you don't make the car. You're going to drive along the motorway from London to Edinburgh, and you know where you start, you know where you're going, and you get on with it, and that's a digital program. But an analog program is you set off, you make the goddamn car, you decide it's like, say, a Morris Minor, you don't control the steering, you go anywhere you want on a B road, and you don't know where the hell you're going to wind up. And that's the difference. And that's part of the joy of it, not knowing and accepting the result and saying, that's interesting. And as I've said,
remarkably, that is exactly how Maz's car works. So maybe that's why he has this interest in the machines.
Well, that's very common. Yeah.
Right. So Rita, I wonder if you have an angle on this as well, because you've obviously known Jack for many years, and he's always been making these machines, and you've got the pictures on your walls in your house and everything. What's your view on these machines?
Can you hear me?
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Can you hear me? First of all, apologies for Jack's cat, who's been determined to either be run round behind him or now on my lap. I should explain that my passion in life is medieval history, heritage, and writing and research. But it's very interesting to be married to somebody like Jack, who has such a very specialized view on art, because I'm a traditionalist, and obviously for me, art has been for many years, what you see in the National Museum of Wales and so on. But I listen to what Jack tells me. I try to understand. I'm very open to new ideas in all fields, arts included, and I think it's very exciting time in development with all kinds of things. Jack, as you probably know, celebrated a couple of days ago his 90th birthday, and we've had 10 days of non-stop celebrations with his family, my family, etc. And my son in Sydney, who sent through a limerick, because Jack loves limericks, he sent through a limerick that he had done for Jack, and he said, I did my best with this, and in the end he said, I put it through a chat bot, I think it's called chatbot or something, artificial intelligence. And he said, every time I said something offensive and rude about Jack, it cancelled it out and put something polite instead. So I think, I'm interested, but I don't know where things are going with all of this. And as I said, somebody who spends most of her time thinking about medieval history is probably not the best person. Jack has my total support. He has I think it's wonderful that you are so interested in what he's doing, and the things that have happened now in the last few weeks have all kind of come together. The very week of his 90th birthday, it's been good with Leonardo and various other things. I don't know what I can add to that really, other than to say he has my total support. And now that he's completed a few of the things that he's been involved in, and he's now 90, he's talking about reinventing himself and moving forward and addressing lots of challenges. And I think at 90, we should all be doing that. I think that's a
I
good
like
way
the sound
to
of that. Yeah.
that's a very, very good way to face life. And yes,
Mm.
you may have a few aches and pains in your knees and your wrists, but as long as your mental capacity, you're interested, as Jack, to use Jack's word, curiosity. Curiosity is very, very important. And I do believe that, you know, the power of the mind and a curiosity will always overcome our various aches and pains that we have as we get older. I think it's an exciting time, and there's a whole world out there to be explored. And Jack has my support.
Lovely. Thank you
And
very much.
thank you for being so interested in Jack's work.
Oh,
Thank you,
very
everybody who's
interesting.
come
Yeah.
along this
Thank you.
evening.
Well,
And apologies for the cat who is rules the house. Jack's cat is in charge. I'm sorry, regardless.
well, cats are always in charge. Yeah.
Yeah, aren't they just?
I wonder if before we finish, I do open it up to any questions in case anybody out there has anything in particular they'd like to ask.
Yeah, I'd be pleased to hear anybody's. Other people's opinions are so important because that's why we produce artworks to allow people to use them as vehicles to express their own interest in life and art and general things.
So the question was about Alan Turing and influence on your work.
About Turing's work, all of us are influenced by Turing, and I met Harold Cohen and talked to him at length one time when he was putting an exhibition on in Bristol. So we're all influenced by other people, and we do, as I said before, we stand on the shoulders of giants, and that's something that's as it should be. But so yes, the Turing was an interesting. I think I mentioned earlier on. The main thing I got from it, because he was so much cleverer than most of us I ever will be, is that he made the point about starting points. And I found that it's almost impossible to reproduce a starting point twice with an analog machine, because you have to have some way of setting all the wheels exactly to an accuracy of a degree, and it's almost impossible to do, particularly if you've got slop in the system in the analog linkages.
So when did he write about that? Was that pre-war?
Well, it's some of the writings, and I've read so much stuff about Alan Turing, but it's a point he made about his early computing, in that the starting point was so important, and he made the point that it was difficult to reproduce it twice, and it affected everything.
So that is what we now talk about as the butterfly effect. That little change at the beginning leads to
it's a similar idea. I'm not sure that they're totally analogous, but it's a similar idea. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Do we have any other questions at all? Oh yeah. Yeah.
So when you start a picture, do you have any idea of what you're trying to produce, or are you just making adjustments to the machine to see what happens? Do you have any picture in your head of what might come out?
So did you hear that, Jack?
Yes. Do I have a picture in my head? Well, back what I was saying about the fuzzy notion of intent, vague ideas scud around in your head, and you think, well, what happens if I do so and so? If I put one idea that I've got as an example of that, I've got some motors, oddly enough, out of a Sperry bomb-site computer that I collected years ago from a shop in Leeds, a junk shop, and dealing in ex-army and ex-Air Force stuff. And I thought that in order to pursue the idea of randomness, instead of changing the time sequence in motors, these can be adjusted with their voltage, so that if I had a voltage controller spinning around from 0 to 13.5 arbitrarily, and then switching the machines off at random with different voltages, that might give me an insight into study of randomness and chaos. So that's a new idea. I've yet to carry it out in the workshop, because as I get older, I may have to abandon the workshop and go down to the roots. But at the moment, I've still got it. And that's something I hope to do before I hand over my workshop to a friend who's going to take it over.
And so what you're saying there really is that you have an idea, but you think the machine can help you explore the idea. but you don't necessarily have the image in your head. It's the exploration that you have in your head.
It's this vague idea, if you like, to use a different expression from fuzzy notion. A vague idea might be more consistent with what people normally understand. And I think that probably is something, I'm not sure, I haven't talked to enough artists, but it's something we all do. We have a vague idea and we pursue it with curiosity. The motivation is curiosity. It's what might happen if I do so-and-so, and I put A and D and Z together. Will that give me a different result from L, M, and N? And it's part of the speculative process. I would imagine much of art is wholly speculative.
Mm.
So
right.
does that answer the question of the lady asked?
Yeah.
I think you're exactly right. A lot of artistic process is experimenting with taking an idea, experimenting, and then feeding it back and developing it and developing it and developing it. It's also very much like the artistic research process as well. Practice-based research often operates in that way. You start with an intuition, you develop it into an idea, you refine the idea, and so on. But making stuff is key to it.
How do people react to the idea of, again, it's sacrilege in a way. Most engineers would say they go to a drawing board and they do a detailed drawing and then they'll build what they've drawn. So it is probably something that will upset an engineer that you go to the workshop and you pull some pieces of metal together and switch the machines on and something emerges. And they say, you must be crazy. Probably am. But that's the way I've worked. It seemed to have worked because I think that we could start to speculate here in neuroscience. The subconscious has a big input on what's going on in your brain. I've often found that if I'm doing repetitive tasks on the lathe or the milling machine or something like that, the idea will be buzzing around in my head and I'll come up with a problem. One of the dilemmas of the engineer is you have a machine half built and suddenly you get a light bulb flashing and say, I've had another idea. At the moment, the question is, do you stop building that machine and start to build another with a new idea, or do you see it through with the initial machine? And I think the answer I've come up with that, however tempting it might be to go with a new idea, it always seems to work best. See the other one through, make some notes about the next alternative, and do them both. Finish the other one first, because you never know how it's going to turn out when you finish it.
That's right. You always get new ideas halfway through your current ones. If you always chase the new idea, you never actually complete anything. And that can often be an artist's problem, in that the next idea is always the better one, and therefore you don't complete the thing you're working on now.
Well, some artists have said that an artwork is never finished until they just hand it over to someone. And the interesting thing we haven't touched on, and it comes back to the viewer's share, when an artist has done an artwork of any sort and it goes out into public, like these machines are in front of you now, they have a life of their own. They have nothing to do with you anymore. They're gone. And what happens to them is subject to the people who view them or use them, which partly answers the idea. You have to accept that. You can't, otherwise artists would never hand over an artwork to anyone.
That's right, yeah. Well, I think it's time now for us to probably wrap up the talk, and we're now going to switch on the machines and allow the audience here to have a little poke and a twiddle of the buttons and whatever, and to really understand the machines. But I think you've given us a great insight into your processes.
Well, I thank you very much for your time, for coming to be interested. I hope you have fun with the machines, and I'll be interested to see from Sean later on what you do with them, because that's part of the process. The art process is not restricted to one person or one thing. I think it's an ongoing community thing that happens, and this is what Sean is doing with the machines. Incidentally, the same thing is happening in Eugene, Oregon. My friend Glenn Smith has got a machine that finally arrived, and he's going to do exactly that. He'll do a machine drawing in 3 minutes, which he says the attention span of anybody will give in his museum, and they'll go away with an artwork, and we'll have it stamped. This is a Taitograph artwork produced by John, Mary, Helen, Fred, whoever, and they can go away with an artwork that they produce themselves. that's probably a good note to wind up on.
That sounds great. Right, well, thank you very much. I think it's been a really
Are you-
interesting talk. Thank you, Rita. Thank you, the
Thank
cat.
you. Yeah, the cat.
Yeah. And unless there are any other questions, I think we'll finish this bit of the evening. And like I say, we're going to carry on with the machines.
So you're going to cut off the Zoom now, and
We'll cut off the Zoom and we'll do some work on the machines. Obviously, we're going to be talking. We're going to exchange what we've been doing while the exhibition's on here, which is until the end of May, March, April, May. I might try and organise another showing or two as well, actually. So I'll let you know, but we'll certainly make sure the machines get plenty of exposure.
okay, well, thank you very much indeed. So this is, as they say, goodbye now. Goodbye from
Thank you
me,
very much.
from the machine.
Goodbye.
Thank you. I'll put you.
Bye now.